The dust of Redemption Gulch tasted like failure, and Lorelei Parsons had been swallowing it for 3 straight days. It coated her tongue, gritted in her teeth, and settled deep in the lines of her worn-out dress. Every door had been shut in her face. The saloon owner saw a lady, not a worker. The seamstress saw a rival, not an assistant. The boarding house was full. Now, with the sun bleeding across the western sky, she stood before her last, most improbable hope, the quiet, imposing man who ran the freight ranch at the edge of town, the one the townsfolk whispered about. They called him the Lakota boy. She asked him for work, any work at all, her voice cracking with the last of her pride. He watched her for a long moment, his dark eyes taking in everything. And then he spoke, his voice low and steady as the earth itself. "I have work," he said, "but only if you'll marry me by sunset." The words hung in the oppressive heat between them, more shocking than a rattlesnake's warning. Lorelei stared at the man, certain she'd misheard. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his features a striking blend of heritages that set him apart from everyone in Redemption Gulch. His black hair was tied back with a leather cord, and his eyes the color of rich, dark soil after a rain held an unnerving stillness. He was known as Cody Blackwater. He wasn't a boy, not by any stretch. He was a man forged by the sun and the hard land he worked. "Marry you, Lorelei," whispered the word, feeling alien on her tongue. It was a preposterous, an insulting proposition. She was a widow, a respectable woman, even if her circumstances were dire. She had come here seeking employment, not a scandalous arrangement. That's the offer. Cody Blackwater stated, his expression unreadable. He wasn't mocking her. There was no cruel humor in his eyes, only a flat, serious intensity. He gestured vaguely toward his sprawling property behind him, a well-kept barn corrals holding strong-looking horses, and a small, sturdy-looking cabin from which a thin curl of smoke rose. "I need a wife. Legally. On paper. You need a home, a meal, protection. It's a trade." Lorelei's mind raced, scrambling for purchase. Protection. The word snagged her. She thought of the way Barrett Holt, the town's land baron, had looked at her that morning. Holt had been her late husband, Robert's business partner, a man whose condolences had felt more like an appraisal. He had oozed a predatory sympathy, offering to take care of her, his meaning as clear and dirty as the water in a saloon spittoon. She had felt a chill, despite the blazing sun, a primal fear that had nothing to do with her hunger or homelessness. Robert had always said Holt was a shark who smelled blood in the water. And right now, Lorelei was bleeding. She had arrived in Redemption Gulch 2 weeks ago, following the last letter from Robert, only to find he was dead. A fool's accident, they said. A fall in the mines. Holt had been the one to deliver the news, along with the revelation that Robert's share in their joint venture was worthless, eaten up by debt. She had been left with a single trunk and less than $3 to her name. Why, she finally managed to ask Cody. "Why me? You could have any woman in town, if you wanted a wife. The women in town see a half-breed savage playing at being a white man." He said the words delivered without a trace of self-pity. It was a simple statement of fact. They want a man who sits in their church and tips his hat to the mayor. I am not that man. You're not from here. You have no family to object. You have the look of a fighter who's tired of fighting alone. And he added, his gaze flicking to the sinking sun. I'm out of time. The offer stands. My name on a marriage certificate, in exchange for food in your belly, a roof over your head, and my protection. By sunset. Sunset was perhaps an hour away. It was madness. Tying herself to a complete stranger, a man the town ostracized. But what was the alternative? Another night sleeping in the livery stable, startling at every shadow, facing Barrett Holt again, when her desperation finally pushed her into his grasp. She looked at Cody Blackwater's hands. They were strong, calloused, capable. They were the hands of a man who built things, not a man who lurked in parlors making veiled threats. He saw the war in her eyes. "I won't lay a hand on you if that's your fear," he said quietly. "This is a business arrangement, a partnership of necessity. We can define the terms later. But the deadline is absolute." Lorelei took a deep, shuddering breath, the dust filling her lungs. She looked from his stoic face to the town of Redemption Gulch, a place that had offered her nothing but suspicion and closed doors. Then she looked at the long, open land behind him, a land that promised hardship, but also a strange, stark freedom. She had two choices: the devil she knew in Barrett Holt, or the complete unknown standing before her. "Where is the justice of the peace?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, but it was enough. A flicker of something surprise relief passed through Cody Blackwater's eyes, gone as quickly as it came. "Judge Peterson's office is next to the assayer. We'll have to move fast." He didn't offer his arm. He didn't smile. He simply turned and started walking back toward the town, his long strides confident. After a moment of dizzying hesitation, Lorelei Parsons gathered the tattered remnants of her dignity and followed the man she was about to marry. Walking beside Cody Blackwater back into town was like parting a hostile sea. If Lorelei had been invisible in her poverty, before she was now glaringly, scandalously visible. Faces appeared in windows. Men stopped their conversations on the boardwalk to stare. Women pulled their children closer, their lips tight with disapproval. The whispers followed them like flies. "It's the widow. Parsons, isn't it, with the half-breed, shameless? Must be desperate. What's he want with her?" Lorelei kept her eyes fixed on the dusty ground in front of her, her cheeks burning with a shame so hot it felt like a fever. She was a pariah, tying her fate to the town's other pariah. She could feel Cody's presence beside her, a solid wall of indifference. The glares and whispers didn't seem to touch him. He moved through the town's judgment as if it were nothing more than a mild breeze. Judge Peterson was a balding man with spectacles perched on the end of his nose and a permanent look of mild indigestion. He peered at them over his desk, his office smelling of stale paper and cheap cigars. "A marriage license?" he asked, his gaze flicking between Lorelei's disheveled state and Cody's stone-faced calm. "Bit sudden, ain't it? We're of age and of sound mind," Cody said, his voice leaving no room for argument. He placed a few coins on the desk. "We need it filed before sunset." The judge grumbled, but he pulled out the necessary ledger and paperwork. The scratching of his pen was the only sound in the room as Lorelei signed her name, her hand trembling slightly. Lorelei Parsons. The last time she'd written that name on a legal document, it had been full of hope. Now it felt like an epitaph for the woman she used to be. When Cody signed, his script was surprisingly clean and strong, Cody Blackwater. The ceremony was a bare-bones affair, spoken in a monotone by the judge who seemed eager to be rid of them. There were no flowers, no well-wishes, only the weight of a legally binding contract settling over them. As the judge pronounced them man and wife, the last rays of the sun streamed through the dirty window, painting a bar of orange light across the floor. They had met the deadline. The moment they stepped back onto the boardwalk, the reality of her decision crashed down on Lorelei. They were married. Strangers bound together by desperation and a deadline. Before she could process the thought, a large figure blocked their path. Barrett Holt. He was a big man, his expensive suit stretched tight across a prosperous belly. His face was florid, and a thick greying moustache failed to hide the cruel set of his mouth. He ignored Cody completely, his eyes locking onto Lorelei. "Mrs. Parsons," he began, his voice a low, proprietary growl. "I must have misunderstood. I heard a rumor you were seen in the company of this man. I was just on my way to offer you a more suitable arrangement, a position as my personal ward. I would see to all your needs." "It's Mrs. Blackwater now," Cody said, stepping slightly in front of Lorelei. His voice was quiet, but it had the menacing stillness of a coiled snake. Holt's eyes narrowed, finally acknowledging Cody. A look of pure venom passed over his face. "You've made a grave mistake, girl," he hissed at Lorelei. "Tying yourself to him. There are forces at play in this valley you don't understand. I own this town. And what I don't own, I take." He gave Cody a look of utter contempt. "That includes land that's fallen into the wrong hands." The threat was unmistakable. This was not just about her. This was about Cody, about his ranch. Lorelei felt a surge of unexpected defiance. Holt had offered her a gilded cage, a life as his possession. Cody had offered her a partnership, however strange and stark its terms. "I have made my choice, Mr. Holt," Lorelei said, finding a strength she didn't know she possessed. "I suggest you honor it." Holt's face purpled with rage. For a moment, Lorelei thought he might strike her. Instead, he gave a short, ugly laugh. "You'll regret this, both of you." He turned on his heel and stormed away, his heavy boots thudding on the boardwalk like a promise of violence. The encounter left Lorelei shaken. The town's scorn was one thing, the focused hatred of a powerful man like Holt was another. She looked at her new husband. His face was grim, his jaw tight. "Let's go home," he said. The word home sounded foreign and absurd. They walked to his wagon, a sturdy buckboard loaded with supplies. As they rode out of Redemption, Gulch leaving the judgmental eyes and the gaslights behind, Lorelei felt a profound sense of dislocation. She had burned her bridges, not that there were many to burn. She had thrown her lot in with a man she didn't know, against an enemy she was just beginning to understand. The wagon wheels rumbled over the hard-packed earth, carrying her into a future that was as vast and dark as the encroaching night. The journey to Cody's homestead was made in near silence, the only sounds the creak of the wagon and the steady clop of the horses' hooves. The twilight sky was a canvas of deep purples and bruised oranges, vast and intimidating. Lorelei wrapped her thin shawl around her shoulders, though the chill she felt had little to do with the evening air. She risked a glance at the man beside her. His profile was etched against the fading light, his attention focused on the trail ahead. What had she done? Who was this man? His land began at a creek marked by a sturdy fence that looked recently mended. Blackwater Creek, he called it. The homestead itself was nestled in a shallow basin, sheltered by a stand of cottonwoods. It was larger than it had appeared from a distance. The barn was well constructed, the corrals were solid, and the cabin, though small, was built of thick, well-fitted logs with a stone chimney. It was a place of substance, built to last. It was a home. Cody pulled the wagon to a halt near the cabin and set the brake. "I'll tend to the horses," he said, his voice still low and formal. The doors unlocked. There's stew on the stove. He swung down from the wagon with an easy grace, leaving Lorelei sitting alone in the gathering dark. She hesitated, then slowly climbed down her legs, stiff. The cabin door opened with a slight groan. Inside, a single lantern cast a warm, golden glow. The space was simple, masculine, but immaculately clean. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a bed was neatly made in the corner, and a small table with 2 chairs sat in the center. A pot simmered on the cast-iron stove, emitting a savory aroma that made her stomach clench with a hunger so sharp it was painful. He had been expecting her. Not just her, perhaps, but a wife. The thought was unsettling. When Cody entered a few minutes later, he found her standing awkwardly in the middle of the room. He washed his hands in a basin on a washstand, the silence stretching between them thick with unspoken questions. "You should eat," he said, nodding toward the stove. He ladled stew into 2 bowls, the portions generous, and placed them on the table, along with a loaf of dark bread. They ate in silence. The stew was rich with venison and root vegetables, and Lorelei devoured it, trying not to seem as ravenous as she felt. It was the first proper meal she'd had in days. When she was finished, she looked up to find him watching her, his expression still hard to read. "Now for the terms," he said, pushing his empty bowl aside. "This is your home now. You are safe here. No one will bother you. In return, I expect you to contribute. Cook, clean, mend. Whatever you're able. This is a working ranch, not a charity." "I understand," she said quietly. "I've always earned my keep. There is one bed," he stated, his gaze direct. "It's yours. I'll take the floor by the fire." Lorelei felt a knot of tension in her chest loosen slightly. It was a small gesture, but it meant the world. It affirmed his promise that this was a contract, not a violation. "Thank you. One more thing," he said, leaning forward slightly. "You need to understand why this had to happen today. Why it had to be by sunset." He stood and walked over to a small wooden chest from which he retrieved a folded document. He spread it on the table. It was a land grant, signed and sealed, bearing the name Cody Blackwater. "This land was my mother's," he said, his voice taking on a new depth. "Her people, the Lakota, have lived in these hills for generations. My father was a white trapper. He understood their ways. When the government started carving up the territory, he used his knowledge to file this claim for her, legally under the Homestead Act. It was his way of protecting her legacy. The Act requires improvements and residency. But there's a clause men like Barrett Holt know how to exploit." He tapped a line of fine print. It stipulates that if the claimant is unmarried, any challenge to the survey or claim boundaries must be answered within a certain time frame. Holt manufactured a challenge, a fraudulent survey dispute. The deadline to have it dismissed was today. With a wife legally registered to the deed, the claim becomes a family homestead. It's granted a different level of protection under the law. It extends the deadline and makes his challenge almost impossible to uphold. Marrying you today secured this land. It blocked Holt's legal theft. Lorelei stared at the paper, the pieces clicking into place. This wasn't some romantic or predatory whim. It was a desperate, strategic move to save his home, his entire world. He hadn't just been offering her protection, he had been seeking a very specific kind of help himself. He needed a wife, any wife, to become his shield. "So I'm—" a legal technicality. She said the words tasting like ash. "You are the partner who helped me save my home," he corrected her, his eyes intense. "Holt wants this land. Badly. My father always said there's more than just grass and timber here. The creek never runs dry, even in the worst drought. For a cattle baron like Holt, controlling the water in this valley means controlling everything. He likely had a hand in your husband's accident. A man who gets in Holt's way tends to run into bad luck." The mention of Robert sent a fresh wave of grief and anger through her. Had her husband been another pawn in Holt's game? Another obstacle to be removed. She looked at Cody, this man who was now her husband. He had played a desperate hand, and she was the card he had drawn. They were two solitary people caught in the crosshairs of a ruthless man. The marriage was a sham, a contract of convenience. But the danger it was meant to fend off was terrifyingly real. "He will not let this go," Lorelei said, her voice barely a whisper. "Holt will not simply give up because of a piece of paper." "No," Cody agreed, his face grim in the lamplight. "He won't. This is just the beginning." That night, Lorelei lay in the surprisingly comfortable bed, listening to the crackle of the fire and the sound of Cody's steady breathing from his place on the floor. She was Mrs. Blackwater. She was the wife of a stranger and the enemy of a powerful man. She had traded one kind of desperation for another, and as sleep finally claimed her, she didn't know whether she had made the best or the very worst decision of her life. The first weeks of their marriage were a quiet, awkward dance of coexistence. They were two planets in a small solar system, orbiting the central star of the homestead, but rarely crossing paths in a meaningful way. Lorelei rose before dawn, the habit of a lifetime, and found Cody was already gone out, checking fences or tending to the horses. She would start the coffee-bake bread and have breakfast ready for when he returned, his face ruddy from the morning chill. They would eat in their customary silence, the gap between them filled with the clinking of forks and the chirping of crickets outside. Lorelei threw herself into the work. She was determined to prove she was not a burden, but a partner, as he had called her. She scrubbed the cabin until the floorboards shone mended, Cody's worn shirts with neat, almost invisible stitches, and started a small vegetable garden near the creek, her hands quickly becoming calloused from turning the soil. She discovered a knack for it, a satisfaction in coaxing life from the stubborn earth. Cody, for his part, was a tireless worker. He moved with a quiet efficiency, his days a long rhythm of hard physical labor. He was breaking horses for a freight company in a town further west, a contract that provided a steady if modest income. He was strong and capable, and he treated his animals with a firm but gentle respect that Lorelei found herself admiring. Slowly the silence began to thaw. It started with small things. He would leave a bucket of fresh water for her garden on the porch in the mornings. She would leave a slice of apple cake for him on the table when he came in late. One afternoon, he found her struggling to fix a broken handle on the water pump. Without a word, he took the tools from her and repaired it in minutes, his large hands surprisingly deft. "The pin was sheared," he said, breaking the silence as he wiped his hands on a rag. "You need to work it smooth, not force it. My father was a watchmaker," Lorelei found herself saying, the memory surprising her. "He always said the smallest parts were the most important." Cody looked at her, a flicker of genuine interest in his eyes. A watchmaker. That's a patient man's trade. He was, she said softly. He would have liked this land. The quiet. It was the most personal exchange they'd had. That evening the silence at dinner felt less heavy, more comfortable. He asked her about her father's shop, and she asked him about the horses he was training. She learned he had a gift for it, an instinct for understanding the animals, for gentling them without breaking their spirit. But the shadow of Barrett Holt was ever present. One morning, Cody rode out to find a section of his northern fence cut his small herd of cattle scattered. It took them both 2 full days to round them up, Lorelei riding a steady mare named Dust Devil, proving she was more capable on horseback than he might have expected. She was exhausted and sore by the end of it, but a strange sense of accomplishment warmed her. They had faced a problem together and solved it. A week later, their small irrigation ditch from the creek was dammed up with rocks and debris, nearly flooding her fledgling garden. It was clearly sabotage. "It's Holt's men," Cody said, his voice tight with controlled anger as he cleared the blockage. "He's testing us, pushing, trying to make life here impossible so I'll be forced to sell." Sell to him, Lorelei asked, her heart sinking. He's the only one buying, Cody said grimly. He's been trying to force out the smaller ranchers for years. He wants it all. The constant threat began to forge a strange bond between them. They became a team united against a common enemy. She learned to read the signs of the land as he did to notice a track that was out of place or the distant dust cloud of riders. He, in turn, began to rely on her watchfulness. They were no longer just a man and a woman sharing a cabin. They were partners in a siege. One evening, a storm rolled in a magnificent, violent spectacle of lightning and thunder. Rain hammered on the roof, and the wind howled through the cottonwoods. Inside the cabin was a small haven of warmth and light. Lorelei was reading a worn book she'd found in her trunk when Cody spoke from his place by the fire, where he was oiling a rifle. "You're not what I expected," he said, his voice low. Lorelei looked up. "What did you expect? I don't know. A fragile city woman. Someone who would complain about the dirt and the quiet. Someone who would break." "I've had some practice at not breaking," she said, a hint of steel in her voice. He nodded, accepting that. "My mother. She was a strong woman. She was Lakota, but she chose to live here with my father. She taught me how to see the world in two ways. The white man's way of deeds and fences, and the people's way of spirits and connections to the land. She said this place, this creek, was Wakan sacred. Holt sees it as a resource to be owned. He'll never understand that you can't own a thing that's alive." He was opening up to her, sharing something deep and personal. It was a turning point. She saw past the stoic rancher to the man beneath a man caught between two worlds, fighting to protect the only piece of both that he had left. "We won't let him take it," she said, and the word "we" felt solid and true. Cody looked at her, his dark eyes holding hers across the warm, firelit room. For the first time, she didn't see a stranger. She saw her husband, and in his eyes, she saw not just a partner in a contract, but a man who was beginning to see her as something more, too. The storm raged outside, but inside the small cabin, the foundations of their uneasy alliance were settling, becoming something stronger than either of them could have anticipated. The fragile peace of their new routine was shattered by a visitor. He arrived on a painted pony, an older Lakota man with a face like a weathered map and long graying braids. He dismounted with a stiff grace and simply stood by the corral waiting. Cody went out to meet him, and they spoke for a long time in a language that flowed like water over rocks, a language Lorelei couldn't understand. The man's name, she later learned, was Chayton Cody's maternal uncle. Lorelei watched from the cabin doorway, feeling like an intruder. Chayton's gaze kept drifting to her, his expression serious and assessing. When he finally left, Cody returned to the cabin with a heavy silence clinging to him. "My uncle brings news from the reservation," he said finally. "Holt has been there. He's offering money whiskey, trying to get some of the young, angry men to say I have no right to this land, trying to turn my mother's own people against me. Can he do that? He can cause trouble. He can create a story that the Indian agent will believe, a story that a half-blood is stealing sacred land for his own profit." It was a cruel irony. Holt, the man who wanted to exploit the land, was accusing Cody of the same thing. Later that evening, as she was sorting through the meager contents of her late husband's trunk, her fingers brushed against a false bottom. Her heart skipped a beat. Robert had always been a man for secrets. Prying it open, she found a small, leather-bound journal. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Robert's familiar scrawl filled the pages. It wasn't a diary, but a ledger of sorts, filled with cryptic notes and figures. But as she read, a sickening story began to emerge. It was all there in coded language she was just able to decipher. Notes about land surveys, water rights and payments, and two names repeated over and over, Holt and Blackwater. Robert hadn't been Holt's partner. He had been his pawn. Holt had been using Robert's knowledge of legal paperwork to systematically defraud small landowners, buying up their claims for pennies on the dollar after they'd been bled dry by legal challenges and manufactured disputes. The Blackwater Creek property was the crown jewel, the one Holt had coveted for years. The journal detailed Holt's plan to use the unmarried claimant clause to seize it. The final entry was dated 2 days before Robert's death. H is nervous. Says the Blackwater claim is a powder keg. Says I know too much. He wants a final meeting at the old mine. He promised a full share to get me out of the territory for good. The air left Lorelei's lungs. It wasn't an accident. Robert hadn't fallen. Holt had murdered him. He had tied up his loose end, the one man who knew the full extent of his crimes, and he had almost gotten away with it. Her arrival in Redemption Gulch had been an unforeseen complication for him. He hadn't expected the widow to show up penniless and asking questions. His attempts to control her, to either make her his ward or drive her out now, made perfect, horrifying sense. She wasn't just a loose end. She was a potential witness who held the key to his entire rotten empire. She felt a wave of nausea, followed by a cold, clarifying rage. The grief she felt for Robert was now hopelessly tangled with the bitterness of his betrayal. He had been a weak man, a criminal, and his weakness had gotten him killed and left her destitute. She looked over at Cody, who was mending a harness by the fire, his brow furrowed in concentration. He was the real victim in all of this, the target of Holt's greed from the very beginning. Her sham marriage, born of desperation, had inadvertently placed her at the very center of the conflict. She had to tell him. She walked over the small journal clutched in her hand and laid it on the table. "Cody," she said, her voice shaking, "you need to see this. It's my husband's journal. It's about Holt. It's about everything." They spent the next hour poring over the pages, Lorelei translating Robert's coded entries. With every revelation, the grim set of Cody's jaw hardened. The journal was more than just a confirmation of their suspicions. It was proof. It was a weapon. "This is why he killed him," Cody said, his voice a low growl. "And this is why he can't afford to let either of us live." The air in the cabin grew thick and dangerous. The threat was no longer a matter of cut fences and blocked ditches. It was a matter of life and death. Holt wouldn't stop now. He couldn't. He would come for the journal, and he would come for them. As if summoned by their thoughts, a sound drifted on the night wind from the direction of the town. It was faint at first, then clearer, the baying of hounds. Holt wasn't just sending a few hired hands this time. He was coming with a hunting party. Cody stood up, his movements fluid and decisive. He went to the wall where his rifle and his bow were kept. He checked the rifle's action, his face a mask of grim resolve. "He's done pushing," Cody said, his voice deadly calm. "He's coming to finish it." He looked at Lorelei, his dark eyes locking onto hers. The pretense of their marriage, the awkwardness of their arrangement, all of it burned away in that moment, leaving only the raw truth of their situation. "Stay away from the windows." The whispers on the wind had become a roar. The siege had begun. The moon was a sliver in the sky, offering little light as the riders approached. Cody doused the lantern, plunging the cabin into near darkness, save for the faint orange glow of the embers in the fireplace. Lorelei's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the sudden tense silence. Through a small gap in the curtains, she could see them, a dozen men, maybe more, spreading out to surround the homestead. Barrett Holt was at their center, a hulking silhouette on a large horse. Blackwater Holt's voice boomed across the clearing, thick with malice and whiskey. "I know you're in there, and I know you have the woman. I have a warrant here for the arrest of one Lorelei Parsons for theft. Says she stole a personal journal from my office. Send her out, and this can all be over peacefully." It was a lie, a flimsy pretext to justify his attack. The journal was their death warrant, and their only hope. "He's lying," Lorelei whispered, her voice tight with fear. "I know," Cody said from his position near the main window. He had his rifle, and on the table beside him lay his bow and a quiver of arrows. "He doesn't want the journal. He wants it destroyed, along with anyone who's read it." A shot rang out, and a bullet splintered the window frame, showering the floor with glass. Lorelei flinched, stifling a scream. The siege was no longer a threat. It was a violent reality. What happened next astonished her. The quiet, reserved man she had come to know transformed into a warrior. Cody moved with a lethal purpose, a predator in his own territory. He didn't return fire wildly. He was patient. He used the darkness and his knowledge of every rock and tree in the clearing. A man would move into the open, and a silent arrow would fly from the darkened cabin, finding its mark with a sickening thud. A shout, a cry of pain, and one less attacker. He was using the bow to preserve his limited ammunition and to sow terror and confusion among Holt's hired guns. Lorelei refused to be a helpless victim, cowering in a corner. "What can I do?" she demanded, crawling over to him. "Load," he commanded, pushing a box of cartridges and a spare revolver toward her. "Keep this one with you, and stay down." Her hands, usually so steady when sewing or gardening, trembled as she pushed bullets into the empty chambers of the rifle he'd be using next. The smell of gunpowder was sharp and acrid. Outside, the shouting grew more frantic. Holt's men were disorganized, clearly not having expected such fierce resistance from one man. For hours, the standoff continued. They would exchange volleys of gunfire, followed by long, tense silences. During one of those lulls, as Lorelei was tending to a shallow graze on Cody's arm from a ricocheting bullet, he finally spoke of the one thing he had held back. "My Uncle Chayton." He began, his voice low and strained. He wasn't just bringing news. He was reminding me of a vision. Lorelei paused, the cloth in her hand still. "Before my mother died, she had a dream. She saw this land, our home, threatened by a man of stone and greed, a man who would try to swallow the creek. She saw the land saved not by a warrior alone, but by a partnership. She said a woman would come from the east, a stranger with fire in her hair and a storm in her eyes. She said this woman would be the key. She called her Wingyan or Wangjila, the one woman, the one who would make the circle complete." He looked at her, then his face illuminated by the dying firelight. His eyes held a raw vulnerability she had never seen before. "The day you walked up to my fence, your hair looked like fire in the sunset, and your eyes held a storm I recognized. I was out of time on the legal claim. It seemed like a sign, a path laid out for me. Marrying you wasn't just about a law, Lorelei. It felt like I was answering my mother's spirit. It was a desperate gamble, but it was also an act of faith." Lorelei was speechless. All this time she had thought their marriage was a cold, calculated business deal. To her it had been a last resort. To him it had been the fulfillment of a prophecy. It was a staggering, humbling realization. He hadn't just seen a desperate woman, he had seen a destined partner. A new wave of gunfire from outside shattered the moment. One of Holt's men had gotten bold, making a run for the barn, likely intending to set it ablaze. Cody raised his rifle, but his angle was wrong. Without thinking, Lorelei grabbed the loaded revolver she'd been holding. She moved to the cabin's smaller side window, the one that looked out toward the barn. Her father had taught her to shoot a pistol to protect the shop, but that felt a lifetime ago. She rested the heavy barrel on the sill, took a deep breath, as the running figure was silhouetted against the paler dirt of the corral, and squeezed the trigger. The recoil jarred her arm, and the explosion was deafening in the small cabin. The man cried out and stumbled, clutching his leg, his torch falling into the dust. Cody stared at her, his eyes wide with shock and something else, a fierce, burning pride. The failed arson attempt seemed to break the will of Holt's remaining men. They had lost several of their number to Cody's arrows, and were now facing an armed, defiant woman in the cabin as well. The fight had gone out of them. They began to pull back, dragging their wounded. "It's not over," Holt roared in fury, his voice ragged. This isn't over, Blackwater. But his threats were empty. He was alone. His hired army was deserting him. Cursing, he wheeled his horse around and galloped back toward town, swallowed by the darkness. Silence descended, broken only by the chirping of crickets and the groans of the man Lorelei had shot. A fragile, exhausted peace. They had survived. They had held the line. Lorelei's legs gave out, and she slid to the floor, the heavy revolver still clutched in her hand. Cody was beside her in an instant, taking the gun from her trembling fingers. He didn't say anything. He simply put his arm around her, and for the first time, she didn't flinch. She leaned into him, drawing strength from his solid presence. They were no longer just allies in a siege. They were survivors. In the crucible of violence and fear, their marriage of convenience had been forged into something real, something unbreakable. The first light of dawn was a hesitant thing, creeping over the scarred earth in shades of pearl and rose. It revealed the aftermath of the night's battle in stark, unforgiving detail. Splintered wood from the window frames lay scattered like fallen teeth. The brass glint of spent cartridges winked from the dust. The air, usually clean with the scent of sage and pine, was still tainted with the acrid tang of gunpowder. A fragile quiet had settled, punctuated only by the distant pained groans of the man Lorelei had shot, now tied securely in the barn, and the tentative chirping of birds reclaiming their territory. Inside the cabin, exhaustion was a heavy blanket. Lorelei sat at the table, her hands wrapped around a tin mug of coffee she didn't taste. They were still trembling, a fine, persistent tremor she couldn't seem to control. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the flash of the revolver, felt the jarring kick against her shoulder. She had taken a man down. The reality of it was a cold, hard knot in her stomach. Cody moved with a stiff, weary grace, methodically cleaning his rifle. The shallow graze on his arm had been properly bandaged, a stark white line against his tanned skin. He hadn't spoken much since the riders had fled, but a new kind of energy crackled between them, the profound, unspoken bond of soldiers who have survived the same trench. "He'll be back," Lorelei finally said, her voice raspy in the stillness. "Holt won't just let this go. We shot his men. We defied him publicly." "I know," Cody replied, his voice a low rumble. He finished with the rifle and leaned it against the wall before turning to face her. His eyes, dark and deep, were shadowed with fatigue, but held a sharp, focused clarity. "He lost face last night. A man like that can't abide being made to look weak. He won't come back with hired guns next time. He'll find a way to make it legal. He'll get his pet sheriff to invent a charge." The journal Lorelei stated, her gaze falling on the small leather-bound book sitting on the table between them like a time bomb. "It changes everything. It's not just our word against his anymore. It's proof. Proof is only as good as the man you show it to," Cody countered grimly. "Sheriff Miller would likely burn it and arrest us for our trouble." We can't wait here for Holt to make the next move, but walking into town is like walking into the wolf's den. A sliver of an idea, a desperate gamble began to form in Lorelei's mind. She thought of the faces in town, of the fear and deference Holt commanded. But she also remembered one man who had met her gaze, not with suspicion, but with a weary sort of pity. Gus Flanagan, the man at the livery. Cody considered it his expression thoughtful. Gus has been in this valley longer than Holt has. He's a stubborn old root too deep in the ground for Holt to just pull him out. He keeps to himself, but he sees everything. He might help. It's a risk. Everything we have done since I first walked up to your fence has been a risk, Lorelei said, a new strength hardening her voice. She stood, the trembling in her hands finally ceasing. We can't outfight Holt, not forever. We have to outthink him. We have to end this now. The plan they formed was simple and fraught with peril. Cody, knowing the secret trails and gullies of the surrounding hills, would ride a wide, circuitous route to approach Redemption Gulch from the west, unseen. Lorelei would be the decoy and the courier. Dressed in one of Cody's oversized dusters, a wide-brimmed hat pulled low to shadow her face, she would ride Dust Devil straight into town. The journal, their only hope, was wrapped in oilcloth and tucked deep inside her shirt, its weight a constant, terrifying reminder of what was at stake. The ride was an agony of suspense. The familiar landscape felt alien and hostile. Every rustle of leaves in the cottonwoods, every hawk circling high overhead, sent a jolt of fear through her. She kept her head down, her face turned away from the few wagons they passed on the road. She was no longer just the town's penniless widow. She was a fugitive, a combatant. She thought of the woman who had arrived in this town weeks ago, lost and broken. That woman would never have been capable of this. The thought gave her a sliver of courage to cling to. She guided Dust Devil into the cool, hay-scented dimness of Gus Flanagan's livery stable, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against the journal. The familiar smells of horse and leather were a comfort. For a moment, she was alone. The stable was quiet, dust motes dancing in the shafts of light slanting through the high windows. Then a shadow detached itself from a deeper shadow. It was Cody. He stepped forward, his hand resting briefly on Dust Devil's neck. "You made it," he said, his voice low with relief. Before she could reply, Gus Flanagan himself emerged from the tack room, a pitchfork in one hand. His weathered face was a mask of grim concern. "Heard the devil went dancing at your place last night," he said, his shrewd eyes taking in Lorelei's disguise, and the tension coiled in both their bodies. "Figured you might be needing a friend. Holt's been crowing all morning about how he's running a nest of thieves out of the valley." There was no time for preamble. Lorelei pulled out the journal. "It's all in here, Gus," she said, her voice shaking with urgency. "My late husband's records. Proof that Holt has been running a criminal enterprise for years. Proof that he had Robert murdered." Gus set the pitchfork aside and took the book, his gnarled fingers turning the pages with surprising care. He squinted at Robert's script, his lips moving silently. After a long moment, he let out a low whistle. "Sweet heavens. I've seen Holt ruin good men over less. But this is the whole rotten enterprise, root and stem. This could bring him down." He looked up, his expression grave. "But who do you show it to? The sheriff is his man, and the judge is a coward." A sense of hopelessness began to descend on the small group. They had the weapon, but no one to wield it. And then a sound cut through the morning air, a long, mournful blast that echoed through the valley. The steam whistle of the 9 o'clock train. Cody's head snapped up. The U.S. Marshal, he said, a new fire in his eyes. He makes a circuit through the territory. He's not due for another month, But sometimes the schedules change. Sometimes the train runs early. Gus finished the spark of a desperate hope igniting in his old eyes. If there's a marshal on that train, he's your man. He answers to the federal government. Barrett Holt can't buy him, and he can't scare him. The final desperate phase of their plan was thrown into motion. Gus and Cody hurried toward the depot, blending in with the small crowd that always gathered for the train's arrival. Lorelei remained hidden in the livery each passing minute, stretching into an eternity of agonizing suspense. From her vantage point, she saw them. Cody stood beside a tall, broad-shouldered man with a stern face and a silver star pinned to his vest. Marshal Brody. They were speaking intently, Cody gesturing with the journal in his hand. Then the two of them, with Gus trailing behind, began walking with purpose down the main street, directly toward Barrett Holt's imposing two-story office building. As if sensing the shift in power, townsfolk began to emerge from the mercantile and the saloon, their faces a mixture of fear and curiosity. Barrett Holt himself strode out onto his balcony, a look of arrogant irritation on his face, ready to dismiss whatever annoyance had arrived. That look curdled when he saw the marshal's star and the damning journal in his hand. The confrontation was swift and absolute. Holt blustered, threatened, and name-dropped every important politician he had in his pocket. Marshal Brody was a granite wall, his voice cutting through Holt's tirade with cold legal precision. He read from the journal, his voice carrying across the now silent street, laying bare years of fraud, intimidation, and murder. When the marshal called for anyone else who had been wronged by Holt to speak, a breathless silence fell. Then one old rancher, a man whose property bordered Holt's, a man who Lorelei had seen bullied and belittled, stepped forward. His voice shook, but he spoke of stolen water rights. Another followed, then another. It was a dam of fear, breaking a flood of suppressed truths, washing over the man who had ruled their lives for so long. By midday, Barrett Holt, the untouchable baron of Redemption Gulch, was in chains, his face a mask of disbelief and impotent fury. That evening, as the sun began to bleed, color back into the western sky, Cody and Lorelei rode home. They paused on the crest of the hill overlooking their homestead. The creek below was a ribbon of silver. The sturdy cabin stood as a defiant monument to their victory. From here, Lorelei could just make out her small, thriving garden, a patch of determined green in the rugged landscape. "It's safe now," she said, the words full of a profound, weary peace. "We made it safe," Cody corrected her gently. He turned in his saddle to face her, his expression serious. The stoic mask he so often wore was gone, replaced by something open and vulnerable. "Lorelei," he began, his voice quiet but firm. "The bargain we made, it was for your safety and for the protection of this land. That debt is paid in full. You are free. You don't have to be tied to me because of it. I have enough money from the freight contracts. I can give you enough to start a new life, a proper one, anywhere you choose. You deserve a real choice, one that isn't born of fear or desperation." His offer was honorable, and it was the hardest thing she had ever heard. She looked at his strong hands, holding the reins, hands that had fought for her and worked beside her. She looked at his face, no longer that of a stranger, but of a partner. She looked at the home they had bled for, and she knew her answer. The woman who arrived in this valley a few weeks ago needed a roof over her head. She said, her voice clear and unwavering. She would have taken your offer, and she would have been grateful. But she's not the woman sitting here now. She met his intense gaze. "My home isn't just a building, Cody. It's not just a piece of land. It's here." She gestured between the two of them, and the valley below. We started this as a contract to survive. I'd like to see what it becomes as a marriage." A slow smile, the first truly unguarded smile she had ever seen from him, spread across his face. It was like watching the sun break through after a long storm, warming everything it touched. He reached across the space between their horses and took her hand. His calloused fingers, so strong and capable, laced gently through hers. It was a touch that wasn't about necessity or alliance, but about a deep and profound connection. It wasn't the end of a contract. It was the beginning of a vow. Together they turned their horses and rode down the hill, not as two strangers bound by a deadline, but as partners riding toward a new dawn they had earned together. The wild frontier wasn't just a place of dust and danger. It was a crucible that forged the most unlikely of bonds. Lorelei and Cody's story reminds us that strength isn't just about fighting, but about trusting. That home isn't just a place you own, but something you build and defend with a partner you choose. It shows that sometimes a bargain made in desperation can lead to a destiny you never could have imagined. Theirs was a marriage born of a deadline, but it became a love meant to last a lifetime. If their story of resilience and unexpected love moved you, please show your support. Hit that like button to let us know you enjoyed the journey to Blackwater Creek. Share this story with someone who loves a classic tale of the West. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell. We have many more stories from the untamed heart of the frontier waiting to be told, and you won't want to miss a single one. Thank you for listening.